Hey, you might be wondering what's been the holdup. Well, it turns out that one of us, Prehistorica, had some harrowing health issues and absolutely needed the time to heal. As such, we have opted to just skip over his month so that everyone else in the project can at least get their sections all lined up in the big official video. I know a lot of you have been asking me what's going on, so that's it. Hope you enjoy. January, Prehistoric Australia.
Did you know that in 2022, paleontologists made new discoveries about T-Rex's face? They found out that plants did not form the first forests, and proposed that humans eating meat did not drive the evolution of our bigger brains. So if you haven't heard about these discoveries, I'm Andrew, welcome to Prehistoric Australia. Normally on this channel I talk exclusively about Australian paleontology, but today we are participating in PaleoRewind. PaleoRewind is a collaboration of channels that explain the most important prehistoric discoveries of the past year. Each of us are covering a different month of the year. I'll be talking about the month of January, and get pumped, there's an Australian discovery at the end of this video. So without further ado, let's kick off PaleoRewind 2022. The year began with a new study about Tyrannosaurus rex. Published on the 10th of January, the paper examines the neurovascular canals in the face of Sue the T-Rex, who was discovered in the United States. Neurovascular canals are pipes, which contain blood vessels and nerve fibers. The first discovery was that neurovascular canals covered a large area above the teeth of Sue's upper jaw. And this is because T-Rex constantly regrew its teeth and needed blood vessels to run deep enough into their tooth sockets in order to provide sufficient nutrients for both old and newly emerging teeth. The second discovery was that the concentration of neurovascular canals in the snout and lower jaw of T-Rex were not as numerous as predicted. A concentrated sensory network tends to exist in aquatic and semi-aquatic animals, such as Spinosaurus and crocodiles, to sense minor changes in water pressure. Animals based on land don't need this adaptation. As a result, the facial sensitivity of T-Rex was average. Instead, the system of canals could have been attached to pads made of keratin for either temperature regulation or social signaling with other T-Rex. There was also discussion about past research into whether T-Rex had lips. However, this study concluded that the evidence for and against was inconclusive, and further research into that area was needed. So if you want to find out more, Edge has a fantastic video breaking down this paper in greater detail. A long-standing idea is that human ancestors evolved bigger brains and bigger bodies when they started eating a lot more meat in their diet. But is this true? Well, on January 24th, a new paper challenged this popular theory. The theory goes that Homo erectus started the trend of increased meat eating. It is common across East Africa to find fossil sites where Homo erectus is in close proximity to animal bones, bearing cut marks made by stone tools, showing animal hunting behaviour. The major issue the authors found was that these famous fossil sites suffered from spikes in sampling size due to their popularity. Paleontologists have simply made less effort to sample sites from both before and after 2 million years ago. So, the authors recalculated the average trend by first modifying the number of bones based on the amount of effort that went to finding them. The result? The meat-eating frequency of our human ancestors was consistent from 2.6 to 1.2 million years ago. So for now, the meat made us human theory is dead meat, until more evidence is found from the less studied fossil sites. Instead, other theories must now be considered into why our human ancestors developed bigger bodies and bigger brains. Plants did not form the first canopies as first thought. Instead, it was lichens. Lichens are a symbiotic relationship between fungi and either algae or cyanobacteria. Lichen trees are called pneumatophytes and towered over the early plants, from the Ordovician to the Devonian period between 488 to 358 million years ago. And many actually formed the first closed canopies, which was revealed in a new study published on the 25th of January. Firstly, a canopy needs height. An extreme example is Prototaxites logani, the tallest species of nematopide, which lived in Saudi Arabia 392 million years ago and reached up to 22 meters high. Secondly, a closed canopy needs its tree trunks to be in relatively close proximity. Trunk spacings are calculated using data from fossil soils known as paleosols. For example, the Brenda paleosol from the United States was used to calculate spacings ranging from 11 to 23 centimeters for a Silurian species that grew densely, like a field of corn plants. Thirdly, a closed canopy needs branches at the top of its trunk. Some nematophytes branched sparsely and allowed a lot of light to pass through. Others had flat or thin or common branches. Overall, lichen tree forests were incredibly important as their initial canopies provided safe, shaded habitats for the first plants to spread across the land. Most marsupials today live in Australia, but they did not originate here or even evolve during the age of mammals. In fact, a new study published on the 30th of January is confident that marsupials evolved during the age of dinosaurs. A phylogenetic analysis of 6 fossil mammals discovered that Deltatheridium had enough distinct traits to be considered a true marsupial. In life, it would have looked like a 15 centimeter long opossum with carnivorous teeth. In fact, CT scans of new specimens revealed that its teeth in particular were distinctly marsupial, in the sense that the last premolar is the only tooth to be replaced after birth. It lived in Mongolia around 80 million years ago during the late Cretaceous period, meaning that Deltatheridium is the oldest known marsupial in the fossil record. I promised you a discovery from Australia, and here it is. A paper published on the 7th of January revealed new, well-preserved, soft-bodied fossils of plants and animals that lived in rainforests and responded in different ways to the drying Australian climate. They come from a New South Wales fossil site called McGrath's Flat. It most likely was once a gentle billabong in a mesic rainforest between 16 and 11 million years ago during the Miocene epoch. At this time, rainforests like McGrath's Flat were on the brink of retreating as Australia became drier and more arid, a process called aridification. So naturally, at this site, plant fossils include both classic rainforest species, but also species you would expect to find in dry environments. The rainforest specialists include both Nothofagus and Lagodium. They no longer survive in the arid conditions of McGrath's Flat today, and are typically only found in coastal patches of wet tropical rainforest. What can we learn from the animal fossils at this site? Well, just like the rainforest plants, many fossil insects, such as alderflies, caddisflies, and Massoterms termites, have relatives that today are only found in warmer and wetter conditions around Australia, especially patches of tropical rainforest. Clearly, these insect groups did not adapt to drier conditions, but instead relocated to regions that remained warm and wet. Overall, by comparing the types of fossils found at McGrath's Flat to the distributions of their modern-day relatives, we can clearly see that some retreated while others expanded their distribution. But all of these responses prove that Australia was indeed drying out during the Miocene epoch. So, there you have it. If you enjoyed learning about this Australian discovery, what are you waiting for? Check out our other videos about Australian paleontology.
February. Raptor Chatter.
Hey everyone, this is Zico Callahan, and I and the channel Raptor Chatter are part of PaleoRewind 2022, largely organized by the channel Edge. So go check them out, but also all the other people that are participating. For today's video though, we're going to be looking at what happened for paleontology in February. And there's a lot of papers that are a lot broader, but this is just a narrow selection of some of the most interesting. So let's get started where it all begins. And by that I mean chronologically. We're looking at the oldest fossil of the papers that I've chosen. And that's because this one talks about an animal closely related to Opabinia. Opabinia is a fossil from the Burgess Shale, and it's really the inspiration for Stephen Jay Gould's book, Wonderful Life, and the history of the Burgess Shale, because it's really unlike anything and it helps to punctuate a lot of those ideas of, look, life evolved really quickly after the Cambrian explosion. The thing is, this new animal, Euterora camosa, doesn't come from the Burgess Shale, instead coming from Utah and specifically the Wheeler Formation. Now, Opabinia has often been considered this really unique animal because there's nothing else in the fossil record quite like it. And that's because it had 5 eyes and this weird claw at the front, and also these kind of wing-like appendages, including a little bit of further pointed up wings towards the tail. So it's really, really unique. The thing is, it's a little less unique now because there's another one. And again, coming from around the same time during the late Cambrian. So it wasn't necessarily that this one lineage just split off and became Opabinia, this totally unique animal. Instead, it looks like maybe Opabinia was part of a larger group that did specifically evolve those adaptations, rather than just being a single lineage that led to it. So maybe Stephen Jay Gould was kind of jumping the gun a bit, although he also wrote the book way back in the day. So it's not necessarily that shocking when we didn't have nearly as many fossils as we do today. And jumping way up, we're going to be going to the Middle Jurassic of the Isle of Skye, a small island off the coast of Scotland. But it has had a lot of really unique geological and paleontological finds. So it's really useful for understanding some of the really important times of dinosaur and also importantly in this case, pterosaur evolution. And that's because they found the first really big-bodied pterosaur coming from the Middle Jurassic. And the really cool part is it's not even related to the other later larger pterosaurs, which mostly lost their tails. Instead, this one still had a tail. Jark Skignath, which the name is in Scottish, so if I'm not pronouncing that right, Scottish viewers, please let me know. It comes from this Isle of Skye, and importantly again, it's a large pterosaur relative to the time. Most of the other pterosaurs we find around this time that are related to it are things like Rhamphorhynchus, which is much smaller, maybe the size of a pretty large crow or raven. Meanwhile, this one had a wingspan as large as a man. And the thing is, it probably got even larger than that. They actually were able to cut open sections of the bone and look at some growth rings, and they suggest, no, this thing was even still growing at this time. It wasn't necessarily a small organism, said no, it was definitely still growing. It was a very large pterosaur for this time period. And it kind of goes against what we've normally thought about. Oh, the pterosaurs stayed really small up until just about the Cretaceous, and then they got big in the Cretaceous. No, they got big pretty quickly after first evolving. Staying with the pterosaurs, but this time jumping to China, we're looking at Kungpengopterus. This animal actually made the news last year because a newly found species of it was found to have had an opposable thumb. And the original species that this study is on may have also had that thumb. The fossils just really aren't preserved in an orientation to identify if it did have that opposed thumb. However, these ones actually come with some of the gut contents preserved, which is really cool because we can start narrowing down what they definitely ate and potentially what their diets may have been. And the thing is, both of these are pretty similar because they both contain fish and not really much else. So that may suggest that they may have been fish specialists, essentially going around feeding on fish, and then eventually they died, washed into the lake where those fish were, but towards the bottom there wasn't oxygen, meaning that the fossil was pretty well preserved. I do want to mention though, before you jump to conclusions, that this is a sample size of exactly 2. So it's not really great when you consider how many of these organisms would have lived throughout the species' entire time frame. So we really would hopefully like to find more fossils like this so we can have a good amount of a sample size to try and say, oh yeah, they probably were fish specialists, as opposed to they may have been. And we're going to be staying in the same time period and the same place, except this time looking at a mammal. Cocotherium geophutingensis is this new mammal. And the thing is, it doesn't seem super unique unless you really know what you're looking for, and that's because of certain structures in the jaw. Mammal jaws are just fundamentally weird, because we really only have the one bone making up our lower jaw. Meanwhile, in most other animals, there's multiple bones making up the lower jaw. Because as evolution progressed, mammals had 2 of those bones move inside the ear, meaning that we do have more precise hearing. The thing is, that also means that our lower jawbone, the single one there, had to do more things. And there was something called Meckel's cartilage there. Meckel's cartilage is cartilage alongside parts of the lower jaw, which would have helped to attach different muscle ligaments. However, the important part is, we don't have Meckel's cartilage because it's turned entirely to bone. So it's something that's totally different from what this animal had. Almost. Because we can actually see some of that cartilage, because this is again very fine preservation, starting to change into bone. Essentially, the evolutionary process of moving from cartilage to bone is taking place in Cocotherium. So we have a really great landmark for understanding how some of the evolution of the mammal jaw actually occurred. So in 2017, for my wife and I's 1-year anniversary, we went to Japan, and one of the places we visited was the Fukui Prefectural Dinosaur Museum. And that means we got to see the fossils of Fukui venator on display. And that's what this paper is about, Fukui venator. In large part because it's kind of been in a confusing place. It's not the most complete fossil in the world, and has some really interesting characteristics. For example, some of the teeth towards the front of the mouth are definitely pointed and for grabbing small prey. But some of the ones towards the back are more peg-like, and likely for eating plants, so it was kind of this omnivore. Additionally, many studies had kind of found it up in the air phylogenetically. It was some sort of Coelurosaur, but that's a really big group. It includes Compsognathids and Tyrannosaurs, and all of the bird-like dinosaurs, as well as a few other groups. And this study helps narrow down which one of those other groups it may have actually belonged to, because they found that it was the basal-most Therizinosaur. The most famous Therizinosaur is Therizinosaurus because it had massive 3-foot-long claws that it likely used to help pull on tree branches and then eat those plants. The thing is though, Fukui venator doesn't perfectly fit into this kind of body plan, in part because it was much smaller. I mean, you can see the entire fossil of Fukui venator here. Meanwhile, here I am next to a cast of another Therizinosaur, Nothronicus, at the Museum of Northern Arizona. So some of the later Therizinosaurs got much larger, and that's something we don't really see happening in Fukui venator. But that does make at least some sense because here we can still see that it was at least somewhat of an omnivore. Again, some sharp teeth for grabbing prey and some peg teeth for eating plants. They also looked at the tail vertebra and found that the last few of these were actually fused. This is something that's called a pygostyle or a pygostyle, depending on who you are. But all modern birds have it because that's what makes the broad tail fan of feathers in modern birds. And that means that this animal also would have potentially had that same kind of tail fan, which is important because in general that means it would have had flight-type feathers. They would have been asymmetrical and leaned to one side essentially. That means that potentially the first flight feathers evolved before Therizinosaurs split off from the lineage that would eventually become the birds. And we're going to stay in the Cretaceous, but this time jump all the way over to Portugal. And that's because there was a new Spinosaurid found, and Spinosaurids are sometimes the bane of my existence, because like this new one, Iberospinus naturioi, they all seem to be pretty incomplete, and you can see that from this diagram of the fossil here. Now it does still have some unique traits that do help it warrant its own specific category rather than falling into something like Baryonyx or many of the other Spinosaurids which have been found in parts of England and also Spain and Portugal. One of these is that it has only a single nerve coming out of the Maclean sulcus, and that would have helped to give it facial sensation around that area. And the Maclean sulcus isn't the cartilage, but it is named for the same guy, it's just a small depression in the bone. And while they are kind of the bane of my existence because they are partial, and this one is extremely partial, it is important to note that it is unique. Because what that means is that, again, I mentioned Iberia, so Portugal and Spain having a lot of Spinosaurs, but also England had a lot of Spinosaurs. So what we're potentially seeing is the origin point for this group. Essentially, they may have evolved around this part of Western Europe, and then migrated further across the world later in time. And that's because, in general, wherever you find the greatest diversity of a group is where it originated from. And now getting towards the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, we're going to be looking at some of the rocks that come from India, specifically around the Deccan Traps. The Deccan Traps were a series of really large volcanoes that were erupting right around the time of the non-avian dinosaurs' extinction 66 million years ago. And in fact, it's been suggested they may have been the cause as opposed to the impact from space. The thing is, between many of these different volcanic layers, you also get some sandstones and mudstones, and sometimes those preserve fossils, such as here with a fossil fruit. The fruit was found to be a member of the Euphorbiaceae. This group includes some modern, really useful trees, such as the castor oil tree or the rubber tree, so it's really cool to know that this group evolved before the extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. But also it's appearing between these different volcanic sediments, which the fact is that if the plants aren't necessarily going extinct right where this eruption is happening, maybe they weren't the cause for that extinction. And for my final paper that I'm bringing up, we're still going to be looking at that extinction, specifically at the Tanis site in North Dakota. And the lead author, Melanie During, actually has her own video of this paper up on her own channel. And I highly recommend checking it out because A, she's going to be better at explaining it since she did the groundwork, but also importantly, there was some controversy involving this paper because another researcher, it seems like at least essentially, took all of the data and made up some data to fill in the gaps and just stole the release of this paper from her. Essentially, he knew this paper was coming out, and so he made his own paper and released it first so that he could get the credit. And for more of the details on that ethics issue, Edge is going to be doing the video for the month that news released, which is December. So that'll be out on the 31st of this year, so very, very end of this year. But essentially, the paper does suggest that the impact happened in the early spring. So you would have had a lot of new growth of plants and then just suddenly nothing. And that would have just exacerbated the issues that were happening at the time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you want longer monthly updates, feel free to check out my channel because I do those and I talk about some of these papers in more detail and or bring up some papers that aren't necessarily as important for a year in the review, at least for the average person.
March. Thought potato.
Have you ever heard of a Margosaurus? Weighing between 3 and 4 tons and measuring up to 43 feet, or 13 meters, it's considered small, for a sauropod anyway. It also has a relatively small neck for its body, again when compared to other sauropods. But what makes this particular dinosaur so recognizable are its extremely tall, upwardly projecting neural spines on the neck and anterior dorsal vertebrae. Portions of these spines were bifurcated, meaning simply that they formed a double row. Also important to note is that these spines are circular in cross-section and tapered toward their tips. Ever since the first and only skeleton was discovered in 1984, scientists have debated the exact function of these spines. In 1991, Salgado and Bonaparte suggested that, due to their tapered tips, perhaps the spines were used for defense. This makes sense, especially because when a Margosaurus lowered its head, the spines pointed forward. Other scientists argued that they were used solely for sexual display or to intimidate rivals. You know, the usual stuff. Artwork has often depicted a Margosaurus with a large sail, much like Spinosaurus or Dimetrodon. The fact that the spines were bifurcated led some artwork to show them with 2 sails, though even this was debated. Some scientists, such as Gregory Paul, thought that any sails were unlikely, however, as they would have reduced neck flexion and that the spines were circular in cross-section rather than flattened, as is the case in sail-bearing animals. He proposed that this circular shape was more indicative of supporting a keratinous sheath that, in life, would have extended the length of the spines. He also hypothesized that the spines could have been clattered together to generate sound. Still others suggested that perhaps the spine supported a fleshy hump, much like an American bison. And so the debates raged on, undoubtedly devolving into fistfights more often than not. But this year, a study published in the Journal of Anatomy sought to settle the argument once and for all, or at least provide some evidence. In this study, called Osteohistology of the Hyperelongate Hemispinous Processes of a Margosaurus kazoui, Dinosauria sauropoda, Implications for Soft Tissue Reconstruction and Functional Significance, a group of scientists analyzed for the first time external morphology, internal microanatomy, and bone microstructure of the hemispinous processes and compared them to another similar species from the same region. The study revealed highly vascularized fibrolamellar bone interrupted by cyclical growth marks, as well as secondary remodeling, evidenced by the presence of abundant secondary osteons irregularly distributed within the cortex. What does all this mean exactly? Well, for one, contrary to popular thought, both anatomical and histological evidence revealed by the study indicate that a Margosaurus's spines didn't have a keratinized sheath, also known as a horn. Not only that, but the presence of specifically oriented Sharpie's fibers seemed to indicate that the spines were connected by ligaments. In short, the data this study uncovered strongly indicates that rather than a hump or standalone horns, a Margosaurus did indeed have a cervical sail. This is also likely true of other species in its family, giving us some fascinating insight into how these creatures looked. Now we just have to figure out what the sail was for. Near the eastern coast of Brazil lies an unassuming cave, little more than a hole in the ground. If you walked by it, perhaps on a midday stroll, you may not even notice it at all, but this cave conceals a wealth of dead creatures dating back millennia. In fact, the Toca das Onças site, as it's called, is considered one of the richest paleontological sites of the Brazilian Quaternary. Why? Well, simply put, it's because many prehistoric creatures met their demise in this cave. Two hypotheses have been proposed as to the large number of bones found here. First is that many animals climbed down the vertical shaft looking for water, but found themselves trapped. The second is even more simple. Due to the vertical character of the cave entrance, it acted as a natural trap. Among the remains found here are two complete skeletons of Eremotherium laurelardi, a giant ground sloth which went extinct in the early Holocene. Now, we can learn a lot about extinct animals from the age, composition, and structure of their bones, like when they indicate that a certain sauropod likely had a sail instead of horns. But bones can also shed light on the daily lives of these creatures. By studying bone trauma, scientists can determine predator-prey relationships, lifestyles, behaviors, and myriad other things. The scientists behind a study published in Nature asked the question, what could the bones of Eremotherium laurelardi found in this cave tell us about how these majestic beasts actually died? The team investigated 3 vertebrae found there, 2 thoracic and 1 lumbar, which belong to the same individual and have similar lesions. All lesions were found to be in the caudal end plate of each vertebrae. To rule out damage and preservation, the researchers noted clear signs of osteoblastic activity indicative of a fracture in living bone. Specifically, the fractures were classified as vertebral body compression with sagittal split fractures, which implies that this particular traumatic episode was likely caused by compressive force on the vertebral column. Interestingly, similar compression fractures can appear in human bones, usually caused by osteoporosis. But since their study found no other indications of disease, a similar cause for the E. laurelardi bones were ruled out. But do you know what else causes compression fractures? That's right, falls from a great height. The entrance to this particular cave drops nearly 15 feet straight down, so it stands to reason that perhaps the poor E. laurelardi was climbing down into the cave and fell. But this seems unlikely, as the study notes that this species wasn't known to be a climber. Sadly, it seems that the cave did indeed act as a kind of natural trap into which at least 2 large Eremotherium laurelardi fell to their doom, where they would remain for thousands of years. This is exactly the kind of slice-of-life insight that can be gleaned from what would, at first glance, seem to be nothing more than inert fossils. As someone who grew up loving Tyrannosaurus rex, and really, who didn't, I'm always surprised and fascinated when new evidence gives us new insight into these amazing creatures' appearance, behavior, and physiology. One of the more interesting contributions to our understanding of T-Rex came in the form of a study published on March 1st in Evolutionary Biology. In it, a scientist by the name of Gregory Paul, who we introduced earlier with the Amargasaurus segment, and a few of his colleagues, makes the not insubstantial claim that the traditional idea of a T-Rex actually represents 3 species. There is, of course, the iconic Tyrannosaurus rex itself, but they argue the addition of 2 additional, equally awesomely named species, Tyrannosaurus imperator and Tyrannosaurus regina. Now, there has been contention as to which species are actually Tyrannosaurus rex and which might be separate species for some time. Nanotyrannus comes to mind, and it's now nearly universally thought to be simply a juvenile T-Rex. What makes this study controversial, though, are its bold claims, which are based on what some would call not enough evidence. The study analyzed 3 aspects of 37 T-Rex specimens: dentition, the length and circumference of thigh bones, and overall robustness. Ruling out possible explanations like age, overall size, and sexual dimorphism, and relying on additional evidence provided by the location and sediment layers wherein these bones were found, the team concluded that even our most popular T-Rex skeletons actually belong to separate species. The famous Sioux specimen, they argue, is actually the holotype of Tyrannosaurus imperator, while the Wankel T-Rex is the holotype of Tyrannosaurus regina. This is obviously a simplification of the study, and by the way, all links can be found in the description if you want to dive deeper. But since the paper was published, many experts and scientists have disagreed with the conclusions drawn by the study's authors. For one, the sample size of 38 specimens is too small to draw consistent lines between species, as many supposed differences, including dentition and femur size, could easily be accounted for by simple variations between individuals. Of course, speciation over the course of time which T-Rex roamed the Earth isn't a far-fetched idea, but many argue simply that the data provided by this study is hardly enough to be conclusive. Some people also question the study's lack of clarity in assigning certain well-preserved species to a particular category. Ultimately, the study remains in some contention, and only time and more bones will tell who will be vindicated.
April, Erica of Gutsick Gibbon.
Hello, my gentle and of course very modern apes. My name is Erica, or Gutsick Gibbon, and this is my part for this year's PaleoRewind. The PaleoRewind is exactly what it sounds like. The folks who are involved in this cool event that's put on by Edge from the Edge channel pick a month and then cover the cool paleontological discoveries that came to light during that time period. I picked April before I actually looked at what discoveries were spread out amongst which months in this past year, and April is bereft of hominin news. So you're gonna get to hear me talk about non-hominin paleontology. We'll see how that goes. And not only that, but as an additional challenge, we need to keep this below 15 minutes. Truly a daunting task. First on our list for April is a cool new transitional form found for the evolution of prokaryotes to eukaryotes. In a new paper titled Structure and Dynamics of Odonarchaeota tubulin and the Implications for Eukaryotic Microtubule Evolution, Kainer and colleagues found a crucial missing link in the evolution of eukaryotes from a prokaryotic ancestor. Tubules are intracellular structures that help organize the guts of a cell. Prokaryotic tubules are starkly different from eukaryotic tubules, and if you try to genetically alter the eukaryotic tubules into the prokaryotic tubules, you get catastrophic disassembly, which is bad. So how do you get the evolution of the eukaryotic condition from the prokaryotic condition? This is what they sought to figure out. And to investigate this evolutionary transition, the researchers chose to look at the closest prokaryotic relative alive today to eukaryotic organisms, this being the Asgard archaea. Specifically, they're looking at an archaea called Odonarchaeota, which is a hydrothermally living critter. In the abstract, they note that the GTP-bound structure within Odonarchaeota resembles a microtubule protofilament, with the GTP bound between subunits coordinating the plus N subunit through a network of water-bound molecules and unexpectedly by two cations. A water molecule is located suitable for GTP hydrolysis. Time course crystallography and electron microscopy, which is how they sort of investigated the nature of the internal structures of these critters, revealed the conformational changes to GTP hydrolysis. Odin tubulin forms tubules at high temperatures with short curved protofilaments coiling around the tubule's circumference, more similar to FTSZ rather than running parallel to its length as in microtubules. Thus, Odin tubulin represents an evolutionary stage intermediate between prokaryotic FTSZ and eukaryotic microtubule-forming tubulins. So what on earth does all of that mean, since most of us here focus on macroscopic organisms rather than microbiology? Well, what they're saying is actually pretty simple. They're saying that these Odonarchaeota have these microtubule protofilaments, which is more similar to eukaryotic cells. However, the formation of these protofilaments, the sort of structure that they take, is more similar to prokaryotes, suggesting that what we have here is a transitional form, as it were, between the prokaryotic and eukaryotic condition that doesn't result in the deconstruction of the cell. And so, long story short, we can check off another box in charting the evolution of prokaryotes to eukaryotes, which is, of course, a good thing. Next on the list for April is the discovery of a new theropod trackway that shows a pathologic foot. Herrera Castillo and colleagues published a paper titled A Theropod Trackway Providing Evidence of a Pathological Foot from the Exceptional Locality of Las Hoyas. This one is a lot more straightforward than the last paper. They describe a trackway occurring in laminated carbonated limestones of the Las Hoyas locality in Spain. It is unmistakably a large theropod dinosaur trackway encompassing two unusual aspects, namely wide steps and a set of equally deformed left footprints with a dislocated digit. They talk about the other critters that are found sort of in this trackway in the ancient ecosystem, and conclude with all results mutually support the hypothesis that a large theropod dinosaur with a pathological foot generated the trackway as it has crossed an area of shallow water while slowly walking towards the main water source, thus stepping steadily over the benthonic mat over which multiple fish were swimming. And that's super cool, right? What we have is a theropod dinosaur that is enormous in size that has managed to survive having a pathologic condition in its foot, a dislocated digit. And it's just kind of meandering in this ancient ecosystem. We've got this snapshot of a poor theropod with a hurt foot making its way towards a waterhole. I love papers that systematically ground dinosaurs in reality. Not to say that they aren't already grounded in reality, but people tend to look at dinosaurs and think of them in sort of this far-flung time that's almost mythological. But these were animals. These were large animals that lived in interdependent ecosystems, just like the organisms we share the world with today. And so, like the animals that live today, they got in fights, they got hurt, or they twisted their ankles while chasing down prey, and they had to live with these injuries just like a lion might. In the case of this theropod dinosaur, we have a dislocated digit, which would have undoubtedly impacted its ability to hunt. What happened after it laid down this trackway? Did it survive into old age, or did it die shortly after of starvation or of some other accrued injury? I just think it's really cool to remember that dinosaurs, as majestic and awesome as they were animals that lived and died just like anything on the planet at any given moment. The next paper is also thankfully fairly simple. We discovered a new basal ichthyosauromorph. Ren and colleagues published a paper titled A New Basal Ichthyosauromorph from the Lower Triassic of Zibao Guangxi Autonomous Region in South China. So the abstract tells us what we have. They describe a newly discovered basal ichthyosauromorph, so this means that it's an animal that looks like it's going to potentially give rise or have a connection to the ichthyosaurs that come later, from the Lower Triassic. So this is really, really early. It's called Basosaurus or Bisosaurus robustus, the only known specimen of this new species, so they only found one of them. And what they have is a partial skeleton comprised of ribs, gastralia, a limb element, 12 centra, and 7 neural arches. So then they want to compare what they have to other known ichthyosauromorphs or ichthyosaurs and other sort of marine reptiles of the time period to see if it truly does deserve its own species, right? To make sure that it's actually distinct from everything else. And the features that they determined to be unique is that its neural arches lack transverse processes, the dorsal ribs are slender and not pachystoic even on the proximal end, the median gastral elements have sharp anterior processes, the limb element is long, so they're saying this is most likely the radius. They're saying it's large, it's got a length that's larger than 3 meters, which is big for that time period, more in line with the larger ichthyosauromorphs that come later. And it shares noteworthy morphological features with Utatsusaurus hataii, particularly with regard to body size, the morphology of the probable radius. Bisosaurus also represents the first record of an early Triassic ichthyosauromorph from the Guangxi Autonomous Region, extending the known geographic distribution of ichthyosauromorphs in southern China. I'm really glad they have this figure here, figure 2, because to me, I look at the left side here and I'm like, oh, it's a bunch of ribs and some vertebra, because I know primates and really mammals in general, not reptiles, especially not marine reptiles, which is cool that they've done this sort of color-coded version to show us what's what, with the limb elements representing L. So they're saying this sort of neon green structure here is a radius. Radii look really different in reptiles versus in mammals, so I'm just going to take their word for it. Obviously, DV are our vertebral elements. We have R here, which is the ribs, and the gastralia are here in G. And it's a really beautiful fossil. When you look at it sort of spread out here, they've labeled all of the elements, which is super helpful, I'm sure, to folks who are really more versed in ichthyosauromorphs than I am. But they've done a very comprehensive job, I'd say, making the case that this critter is indeed unique. And if it truly is a basal ichthyosauromorph, it's just another step in figuring out the evolution of these very enigmatic animals and why perhaps they were successful for so long. The last 2 papers might be a reach for a PaleoRewind, but I had to get something at least hominin and primate adjacent, and so the next paper we're talking about is the zoonotic origin of human malaria from an ape malaria ancestor. Plenderleith et al. Published Zoonotic Origin of the Human Malaria Parasite Plasmodium malariae from African Apes. So what they've done here is they've utilized a novel genetic approach to the sequences of various different malaria species in order to figure out basically how they're related to one another. They say the human parasite Plasmodium malariae has relatives infecting African apes and New World monkeys, but the origins remain unknown. Using a novel approach to characterize Plasmodium malariae-related species in wild and captive African apes, we found that this group comprises 3 distinct lineages: one of which represents a previously unknown, highly divergent species infecting chimps, bonobos, and gorillas across Central Africa, and a second ape-derived lineage is much more closely related to the third human infective lineage, but exhibits little evidence of genetic exchange with it, so likely represents a separate species. Moreover, they say the levels and nature of genetic polymorphisms in Plasmodium malariae indicate that it resulted from the zoonotic transmission of an African ape parasite, reminiscent of the origin of Plasmodium falciparum. This is a different type of malaria. In contrast, Plasmodium brasilianum falls within the radiation of human Plasmodium malariae and thus reflects a recent anthropognosis. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that the human malarial parasite, the human-specific, I guess I should say, malarial parasite, comes from a more basal version that infected other African apes. It is notable that this happened recently, and the paper argues that it's like in the past 50,000 years. And they even argue very slightly that this may have had something to do with the origin of agriculture. So that had to be what eventually spurred the speciation of the human-specific malaria parasite from the other apes, which is cool and interesting. But I actually think the coolest part of this is the fact that the New World monkey malaria, Plasmodium brasilianum, actually descends from the human malarial parasite, Plasmodium malariae. So they call this anthropognosis, which is the opposite of zoonosis. So zoonosis is when humans can contract a parasite or a disease from animals, like it jumps from other animals into humans and can now infect us. This is the opposite. This is a human version jumping into another species. So anthropognosis occurred with New World monkeys. So basically humans came and populated North and South America, and then our version of malaria adapted so that it could infect New World monkeys, which is of course our closest living relative here on these two continents. Apologize to your local platyrrhines, please. And the last paper I want to go over involves chimpanzees and some implications they might have towards hominin evolution, although that might be a bit of a stretch. I just want to talk about it because it's cool. Goncalves and colleagues published Staring Death in the Face, Chimpanzees' Attention Toward Conspecific Skulls and the Implications of a Face Module Guiding Their Behavior. So chimpanzees do some weird and interesting stuff with their dead. They do what we would ostensibly call mourning, and so these guys wanted to see if they recognized chimpanzee skulls and preferentially paid them more attention as opposed to other species' skulls, amongst other tests. So here they say, we tested chimpanzees' visual attention to images of conspecific, so members of the same species or group, and non-conspecific stimuli, so they compared a chimpanzee skull to a dog, a cat, and a rat skull, as well as their faces, as well as what they call skull-shaped stones. Additionally, we compared their visual attention towards chimpanzee-only stimuli, so what did chimpanzees prefer to look at when shown a picture of a chimp face, a chimp skull, and a chimp skull-shaped stone. Lastly, we tested their attention towards specific regions of the chimpanzee skulls. So when you show them a picture of a chimpanzee skull on a screen, where do they look? So they theorized that they would obviously prefer chimpanzees, and overall, supporting their hypothesis, the chimpanzees preferred conspecific related stimuli. So when shown pictures of a cat, a dog, a rat, and a chimp face, skull, or skull-shaped stone, they always preferred the one that looked like chimpanzees or the most like chimpanzees. Which is super interesting that they seem to recognize that a chimpanzee skull is more similar to them than a dog, a cat, or rat skull. And they even did this with the skull-shaped stone, so they preferred vaguely chimp-like visages as opposed to other animals. And they finished by sort of saying, we suggest the chimpanzee skulls retain relevant face-like features that arguably activate a domain-specific face module in chimpanzees' brains, guiding their attention. So, like humans, they like things that look like them. And I think that's really cool, just in and of itself. So here's a picture of one of the test subjects, Ayumu, performing the eye-tracking session in the experimental booth. So they're tracking, first of all, what they look at, and then what specifically on the image are they looking at. And they note this in the abstract. I didn't touch on it immediately then, but they prefer looking at the teeth, which is interesting, not the eyes. Here's the picture of what they were showing them, the faces facing diagonally and forward. And another thing the abstract noted that I sort of skipped over is that they preferred forward-facing skulls and images. So they liked being looked at head-on, which is cool. And the reason that I said this might have implications for hominin evolution is because very clearly there is a point in time, and it's really around late genus Homo, that we start seeing preferential treatment of the dead, right? So burials for one, but additionally adornment of the dead while they're being buried. Things like Neanderthals putting red ochre on the body and putting flowers on the body, stashing them in specific cases, as we've potentially seen with Homo naledi, a much more basal hominin with a 600cc brain case size that's half that of humans. And to me, what this suggests is that the recognition of the dead as a member of one's own group is, of course, a precursor to preferentially treating them after death. And this seems to be present in chimpanzees, which are typically argued to be more close to the Miocene ape condition, so the ancestral condition of both of us. So what the point is of all of this is that it seems as if our recognition of members of our own group, one, persists after death, and two, is very old indeed. So, my gentle and of course very modern apes, that's what I have for you for April with regard to the PaleoRewind. Perhaps next year, if I'm invited back, I'll pick a better month that's more relevant to hominins in my area of expertise. But what I will say is that it was really cool getting to comb through all of the paleontologically relevant papers in that month.
May. Benji Thomas.
The month of May began with some fantastic dinosaur news, with the exciting naming and description of a new kind of Therizinosaur dinosaur. This animal, based on material from late Cretaceous age deposits in Japan, was named Therizinosaurus japonicus, and had been known for a while before it was officially named, with a previous study having mentioned the fossils but not fully describing them. This paper from May, then, recognised the remains as belonging to a new Therizinosaur, and actually positioned it as a close relative of Therizinosaurus itself. The bones known for this new taxon are unfortunately quite fragmentary, comprising just one partial vertebra and a partial right hand, but bits of 3 claws are included in this material. This allowed for some interesting comparisons between Therizinosaur claws to be made, with the researchers finding Therizinosaurus to have quite slender claws with weak flexor muscles, much like Therizinosaurus itself, and therefore providing more evidence for the claws of derived members of the group being used to hook and pull vegetation towards the mouth. Interestingly, the new taxon is also the youngest Therizinosaur from Japan, as well as being the first to be found in marine deposits in Asia, perhaps suggesting that these dinosaurs were adapted for life in coastal environments. Not long after, on the 6th of May, a very cool study that looked at how trilobites mated was published. The paper explains that although eggs had been found in trilobite fossils before, direct anatomical and behavioural mating adaptations had not been identified in these animals until this publication. Looking at a specimen from the famous Burgess Shale deposit, the paper showed that the arthropods possessed specialised appendages that were likely used as claspers, used by the males to grip onto the spines of the females, much like how horseshoe crabs reproduce. It's a pretty amazing discovery, showing evidence of sexual dimorphism in these organisms, as well as indicating that these complex mating behaviours originated in arthropods all the way back in the Cambrian. May also saw the incredible announcement of the first complete ichthyosaur to be found in Chile. Nicknamed Fiona, this specimen was actually first discovered in 2009 in the Tyndall Glacier of Chilean Patagonia, and a team of paleontologists led by Dr. Judith Pardo Perez and including Dr. Dean Lomax journeyed there in early 2022, braving the harsh conditions of the region in order to extract and conserve this remarkable specimen. It's 4 meters long, is likely to represent a new genus of ichthyosaur, and comes from the early Cretaceous period. But best of all, it's a pregnant specimen containing several embryos. The team of scientists also managed to discover an amazing 23 new specimens of ichthyosaurs from the site, including juvenile individuals. It's going to be very exciting to see what new discoveries are made thanks to these incredible fossil finds. We also had quite a bit of Megalodon news in May this year, with the publication of a paper that looked at a very strange tooth from the infamous giant shark. This particular tooth looks like it had been split down the middle, resulting in what's known as a double tooth pathology. Comparing this specimen to similar cases in the modern bull shark, the researchers managed to determine that it had been caused by an injury while feeding, and was not a developmental artifact. Such pathologies are frequently seen in mammals, but are less well understood in sharks, with it seeming that perhaps the prey items targeted by Megalodon were actually more diverse than previously realised, as bull sharks, which also display such tooth injuries, feed on animals recorded to cause such traumas, such as rays, sawfish, spiny fish, and sea urchins. So the researchers suggest, perhaps Megalodon also sometimes fed on similar prey, in addition to marine mammals. There was also some very interesting Spinosaur news, with a fragmentary maxilla from the early Cretaceous of Spain being reported on. This bone had previously been assigned to Baryonyx, but this new study found that it's more likely from an indeterminate Baryonychine, closer to Baryonyx than Suchomimus. The paper also helped to clarify some of the anatomy of Spinosaurid skulls, with comparisons between this fossil and others helping to better refine some of the characters unique to this grouping. Also in May was a paper published in Nature Communications that documented the discovery of more Denisovan material, which is always exciting. A single molar was found in a limestone cave in the Annamite Mountains in Laos, dating from the Middle Pleistocene between 164 to 131,000 years ago. By looking at the internal structure of the tooth, the researchers were able to determine that it probably came from a young female individual. Morphological similarities with other Denisovan specimens showed more evidence that it is most probably from one of these humans, further showing how this area of Southeast Asia was a hotspot of homodiversity at this time in the Pleistocene. On the 21st of May, we got the wonderful news that the statue of Mary Anning was unveiled in her hometown of Lyme Regis. May 21st would have been her 223rd birthday, and the statue was the result of 4 years of campaigning by the amazing people at Mary Anning Rocks. Hundreds of people were in attendance to watch the monument be unveiled, and I still can't wait to hopefully go and see it for myself soon. There was also a very exciting naming of a new genus and species of Pliosaurid, one of the large, short-necked members of the plesiosaurians. Given the name Iardosaurus powelli, this remarkable specimen was found near Oxford in the UK and dates back to the Middle Jurassic. The fossil itself is really quite complete, with the skull and most of the body being intact and articulated, and had actually been on display in the Oxford Museum for a few years before finally receiving a formal description in May. Coming from the Oxford Clay Formation, Iardosaurus now brings the number of Pliosaurid genera known in this formation up to at least 6, making this a particularly rich Pliosaurid assemblage. The teeth of this animal also show an unusual feature that previously was only seen in a species of Liopleurodon among mid-Jurassic Pliosaurids, indicating that this may be a more widespread trait than we'd thought before. We were of course also treated to the absolutely fantastic Prehistoric Planets series in May of this year, streaming on Apple TV Plus from the 23rd through to the 27th. This incredible series, narrated by Sir David Attenborough and featuring a score by Hans Zimmer, portrayed various environments and the prehistoric creatures inhabiting them during the very end of the Cretaceous period, and was an absolute dream come true for fans of paleontology as it featured a lot of very recent and up-to-date ideas about the biology of these animals, not to mention how mind-blowing the visual effects were. There was also a fascinating study investigating the metabolic rates of extinct organisms around this time. By using a type of spectroscopy to quantitatively measure a correlate for metabolic rate in bones from living and extinct animals, researchers were able to show that endothermy, or warm-bloodedness, independently evolved in mammals and plesiosaurs, while also showing that it's the ancestral condition for ornithodyrans as a whole, the group that includes pterosaurs and dinosaurs. So, higher metabolic rates were ancestral to pterosaurs, ornithischians, theropods, and sauropods, but then, interestingly, it seems that ornithischian dinosaurs reduced their metabolic rate more towards ectothermy. The study also found that giant sauropods and theropods were not gigantotherms, as some people had proposed, but true endotherms instead. Increasing endothermy also evolved along the avian lineage, but the widespread occurrence of this type of metabolism among many groups that lived at the end of the Cretaceous therefore seems to suggest that factors other than metabolic rate must have determined which groups survived and which went extinct at the end of the period. On the very last day of May, they just about squeezed in another paper on everyone's favourite giant shark. This time, the study examines the geochemistry of fossil teeth from both Megalodon and from the great white shark, looking specifically at the differences in zinc isotopes in the tooth enameloids between them. Zinc isotopes, it turns out, are incredibly good indicators of these animals' trophic levels, and therefore their positions within the ecosystem. The researchers found that there were significant differences between the zinc isotopes among populations of both sharks, suggesting that dietary shifts occurred during the Neogene in both these shark species. Additionally, it seems that the earliest great white sharks, which coexisted with Megalodon, occupied a very similar trophic level, suggesting that competition with these animals could very well have contributed to the extinction of these massive fish. Significantly, this is also the first time that zinc isotopes have been used in this way to reconstruct prehistoric trophic levels, and seems like a quite promising new technique.
June. Biotiverse.
This is a megalodon. Scary, isn't it?
Actually, me thinks that's a great white shark.
Okay, funny guy, thanks for ruining my surprise.
It's what I do.
Yes, this is a great white, maxing out at around 15 feet on average. This is the megalodon, a mighty beast of the sea that reached over 3 times larger than the great white. And it's dead.
Now hold on a moment. Some nice gentlemen from the pub have claimed to see it while out crab fishing.
No, I don't care what any conspiracy theorist says, it's dead. But that does beg the question, how did it die? Surely it was a combination of many things that we could possibly never know for sure. But a recent study came out and the great white, it might have actually led to its extinction in part. Now, how could we have possibly known that? Well, there's two nifty techniques that scientists use that really narrow it down to make it seem very plausible. These are known as carbon dating and zinc stable isotope analysis. Now, it's more likely you've heard of that first one, so let's start with that. Carbon dating is a technique used by scientists to determine the relative age of really old things. If someone tells you a T-Rex skeleton is 65 million years old, they probably know this through carbon dating. The way this works is that every living creature has two types of carbon atoms floating around in them. Well, technically it's 3, but let's ignore that other one for now. We're focusing on carbon 12 and 14. Don't worry about the source for either one, just know that all living creatures have an equal amount of both within their systems. However, carbon 14 is radioactive.
I've read about radioactivity in my books. An invisible demon sent by the devil himself. Bloody hell! Get it away!
Jesus Christ, not everything radioactive is bad for you. What I mean is it's unstable. So over time, it breaks down into other compounds, decreasing the total amount in your body. Carbon 12, on the other hand, does not do this, as this compound is not radioactive. So you might think that means that the ratio between the two changes over time, and you'd be right. For example, if we happen to find a fossil and record the ratio of carbon 12 to 14 as 1 to 2, this means that animal died just under 6,000 years ago. Okay, so that's one of the techniques covered. But what about that zinc thing I said earlier? Well, the easiest way to describe this one is you are what you eat. Just like carbon, every living thing needs zinc to survive. This element aids in bone building, DNA creation, and so on. Animals themselves cannot produce zinc. Only plants can do that. So that means we need to eat things in order to get our bone fertilizer. And that's where trophic levels come into play. Now, this is going to get complex, so just to make things more interesting, I'm going to be using Danny DeVito here to explain. Trophic levels are basically the tiers within the food chain. So for instance, sunflower Danny DeVito is all the way at the bottom because he produces his own food from the soil and the sun. Snail Danny DeVito then eats the sunflower. He just became a primary consumer. Meanwhile, Gopher Danny DeVito hates his greens. But escargot? Now that's something he's willing to indulge in, making him a secondary consumer. Then Owl Danny DeVito eats the Gopher DeVito, Wolf DeVito eats the Owl DeVito, Wendigo DeVito eats the Wolf DeVito, and so on and so on. And this diet is where we get our zinc signatures from. If yellow sunflower has a red zinc signature, then Snail Boy develops a red signature as well. But sometimes, Snail DeVito wants to treat himself to, oh I don't know, 2 copies of Sonic the movie on Blu-ray HD, which happens to have a blue signature. Boom, you got a purple signature now. And that signature is written into your bones. As remember, zinc aids in bone development. Okay, cool, I tricked you into sitting through a science lesson, and I didn't even play Bill Nye for you.
What an asshole. Am I right?
How does this apply to megalodons and great whites? Well, when you inevitably die.
We all do one day. Kids, better you start coping with it now.
The carbon decay begins, and the zinc signature freezes. So, when you take an old megalodon tooth and a great white tooth, you see they're about from the same age. Great whites are by no means a new animal, first appearing in the fossil record around 30 million years ago. And get this! Their zinc signature is suspiciously similar to that of the megalodon, implying the two titans had the same diet. So tell me, what happens when two animals living in the same place at the same time decide to eat the same food? Competition, baby!
All right, Pinhead, your time is up.
Who you calling Pinhead?
And that's it. The theory is the great white was able to outcompete the megalodon and therefore starved it to death. Forget fearing a mythical giant of the seas. There's already a monster here that already slayed that monster, which you'll probably never see in your life, honestly. They don't like humans or anything, and you're not going out into the middle of the ocean, I hope so. You're fine. Yo, 2 stories for the price of 1? You betcha! Next up, we have an abelosaurid from Egypt and a spinosaurid from the Isle of Wight. 2 new discoveries within a 24-hour period. Starting with Egypt, we have a vertebrae from a species belonging to Abelosaurid ceratosaurs, a joint family of fairly large bipedal dinos, including members such as Carnotaurus and Abelosaurus itself. They are some of the most widespread dinos living during the Cretaceous period. The range includes South America, Indo-Madagascar, Australia, Europe, and parts of Africa. However, this is the first time one of these fossils has been found anywhere close to Egypt. It was first discovered in 2016 from the Baharia Formation, a fossil-rich formation within the Baharia Depression of Egypt, which formed during the early Cenomanian period. This particular fossil is believed to be about 98 million years old. And not only is it the first abelisaurid fossil ever found in Egypt, but it's the oldest one ever found, up to this point at least. But what did it look like? Well, Ohio University has an answer for us. According to Bilal Salem and his team, they believe it was about 6 meters tall, with small teeth, tiny arms, and a bulldog-like face.
Oh, this is beautiful. And so is the white rock Spinosaurid from the Isle of Wight. Conversely, this specimen is the youngest we have on record for its clade, though it is considerably older than the abelisaurid at 125 million years old. The magnificent creature is represented by the fossilized remains of its pelvic and tail vertebrae. Another speciality of the creature is it's believed to be the largest land-based hunter to ever roam Europe. In its prime, it likely stood 33 feet long and taller than 15 feet. Quite the big bloke. And they're still looking for a name. Despite being called the white rock Spinosaurid colloquially, scientists have yet to give it a scientific name proper. I, for one, vote for Buckus spinus. A name fit for a king. I believe you've dropped this. And this king's significance doesn't stop there. Large holes were bored into the rock, suggesting some sort of bone-eating larva had found its way to the carcass first. A rare look at the ancient decomposers at work. Oh, how the mighty fall. I relate to that bugger in some ways myself. You know, with my body missing and all. Seriously, I miss my arse. It was eaten by beavers when I was 3, those bloody bastards. You know, I didn't even want to go in the water, but no. Me mum said, "It'll be fun, sweetie." How's paying medical bills in America for the rest of your life fun?
Psst. Hey, you wanna know a secret? Bah! Haha, scared you, didn't I? Well, it's relevant to our next story. Get this! Dinosaurs had belly buttons. Crazy, right? I always thought they were like a mammal thing, but no. Some birds, reptiles, and other amniotes have them too, though they work differently than ours. The reason you and I have one is because they're scars left over from our umbilical cords. But since those classes come from external eggs, they have no use for such a cord. There's no placenta, but there is yolk. Their only source of food while in the egg. And in order to absorb this, they have to attach themselves to it from their bellies. Some lizards are even born with egg sacs afterwards. However, the sac is only temporary as the animal begins to absorb it back into their body, leaving behind this slit on the stomach that you can see here. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, unless you're a mammal. As they age, the mark smooths over, leaving little evidence it ever existed after only a week or two. And because of that, you can imagine how it'd be extremely difficult to determine if dinosaurs had these as well. We knew they were amniotes as well, so we were pretty confident they would have had belly buttons, but we just didn't have the evidence. That is, until now. And there it is, right on the fossilized remains of a Psittacosaurus. Extremely easy to overlook unless you know what you're looking for. This exact same specimen made the news last year as well, for being the first time a cloaca was observed on a dinosaur. What is a cloaca? I'm glad you asked. Us humans have a butthole and frontal bits, but most birds and reptiles combine the two for efficiency reasons, I guess. And again, we are pretty sure dinosaurs had this as well, we just didn't have the evidence. And I don't think we need to go into any more detail on the cloaca.
Please go into more detail on cloacas.
So let's move on to our final story.
I know you can still hear me.
And now we're at the big one. All of those other stories were great, but this is the one. This one made mainstream news and is probably within the top 5 stories of all year. So, without further teasing, let me introduce you to the Yukon Mammoth Calf. On June 21st, 2 miners working on a site at Eureka Creek within the Klondike Goldfields made the discovery of their lives.
Hey!
North America's first complete mummified woolly mammoth. It had bones, skin, and even fur. The only other time a North American mammoth mummy had been found was in 1948 at a gold mine in Alaska. But for that one, only an arm and a head were found. This one was the real deal. Quickly, the miners contacted Yukon paleontologist Dr. Grant Zazula to report their discovery, who arrived with his team shortly after. They all gasped upon witnessing the creature. Zazula stated, "As an Ice Age paleontologist, it has been one of my lifelong dreams to come face to face with a real woolly mammoth. that dream came true today. This specimen is beautiful, and one of the most incredible mummified Ice Age animals ever discovered in the world. I am excited to get to know her more. The team examined the corpse and concluded it was a female calf. They believe she froze within the Yukon ice during the last American Ice Age, 30,000 years ago. Size-wise, she's comparable to the Lyuba, the only other complete mummified mammoth discovered. That one was excavated in Siberia in 2007. His measurements were 85 by 130 centimeters and weighed 50 kilos. But this is America's story. They named her Nanchoga, meaning big baby animal in the Han language. They estimated she was no more than 35 days old and likely died after being trapped in the mud. At this time, her whereabouts are kind of complicated. She was technically discovered on First Nation land. I'm not going to pronounce it out of respect because I'm definitely going to butcher it, but this land is owned by the descendants of the Han-speaking people, who have been there for 1,000 years, so I'd say they definitely have precedence. And even though Zazula's team did receive their blessings to remove the animal, there's still a whole bunch of legal shenanigans and hurdles that need to be resolved first, but we should receive an update on Nanchoga soon.
August. Spino Dude.
Hello once again, wary traveler. Congratulations, you've survived the year, and once again made it this far into PaleoRewind. How exceptional. Okay, I'm done. Greetings, hello ladies and gentlemen, David aka Spino Dude here to bring you August of PaleoRewind 2022. A big thank you to Edge for asking me to be part of this once again, and let's dive into it because we've got a lot of cool stuff to dig into. Remember the absolute meme of a creature, Caudelorhynchus? Well, a close relative of the living beer keg was unearthed in France, introducing Lelaudorhynchus gondii. I hope I'm saying that right. Despite the specimen being on the larger side, the fossils featured both immature and mature features, which is also present on other large relatives from its family. Juveniles seem to grow much faster and the adults much slower, and the team working on the paper says that delaying skeletal maturity would have enabled them to attain very large sizes by having an extended period of growth. Sedimentological analysis seems to point towards Lelaudorhynchus spending time both on land and underwater, potentially living a hippo-like lifestyle. Just not chasing down cars full of tourists because there weren't any. A sauropod from what is now Colombia during the Jurassic period was unearthed in South America back in 1943, and just this year was properly identified and given a name. Introducing Perigosaurus la Paz, a brand new member of the Eusauropoda clade, known from a single vertebra. The animal lived in tropical lowland forests about 175 million years ago, and its discovery adds to the widespread species, including sauropods, that inhabited low altitudes during the earlier Jurassic, suggesting the animals dispersed and diversified really quickly following a potential anoxic event. A fragmentary animal, but still cool we were able to learn so much about it and its environment. I'm just cutting straight to the chase with this one. Introducing Jacapil caniocura, a new thyreophoran from Argentina. One of my personal new favorite dinosaur discoveries. I mean, just look at this little dude. Although we don't have a ton of material from it, the fossils do show us that this tiny 5-foot animal had really short arms, pointing towards bipedal locomotion like its relative Scutellosaurus. Jacapil also represents the first definitive thyreophoran from Argentinian Patagonia, and has features from basal ornithischians, basal thyreophorans, and ankylosaurs. Seriously a cool discovery and peak character design with the current reconstructions. Well done, Thyreophora. A large order of ray-finned fishes called pachycormiforms inhabited ancient oceans all the way from the Jurassic through the Cretaceous. They were a diverse group morphologically, from the absolutely alien Protosphaerina to the more popular and downright massive Leedsichthys. And now a new species, dubbed KK lafkin, was unearthed in Patagonia just this year. KK grew up to just over 6 feet long and was found with fish remains in its stomach cavity. Fishes be neat, man. A new Chasmosaurian ceratopsian was identified this year, and interestingly enough, from a fossilized skull that's been held in museums for decades now. Previously classified as belonging to the genus Pentaceratops, introducing Bistaceratops froseorum. The nearly complete skull of the animal was unearthed in 1975, and upon further study this year was found to be 2 million years younger than Pentaceratops itself. Discoveries like this make you wonder what other new species are hiding amongst material we've already dug up. Paleontology is a pretty young science in the grand scheme of things, and we're constantly learning more. The oldest semi-aquatic rodent in North America has been unearthed, introducing Microtheriamus articulaquaticus. That's a name. Also representing the world's oldest amphibious beaver. Rodents are the most diverse group of mammals on the planet today, and they can teach us a lot about mammalian evolution. In the case of Microtheriamus, it was really small, estimated at less than 2 pounds, as opposed to a modern-day adult beaver weighing in at about 50 pounds or so. Although Microtheriamus was semi-aquatic, it did not yet have a flat tail to help it swim like modern beavers. A cool discovery for sure, helping us learn more about the origins of our flat-tailed buck-toothed friends. Are you guys ready for one of the coolest marine reptile names? Well, introducing Thalassotitan atrox, a new massive Cretaceous mosasaur unearthed in Morocco. Estimations put it at about 30 feet long. While most mosasaurs featured long jaws and slender teeth, the 5-foot skull of Thalassotitan featured a short, wide snout equipped with thick conical teeth, more similar to modern orcas. It suggested that the animal evolved to hunt larger marine reptiles rather than feeding on smaller organisms. A really cool and unique new giant mosasaur for sure. And the final one I have for you today, a brand new giant sauropod is being unearthed in Portugal. Estimations put the animal at over 80 feet long and belonging to Brachiosauridae. A property owner in Portugal reached out to the paleontologists when he noticed the remains in his yard while carrying out his work. And what's really fascinating is that all of the ribs of the animal are maintaining their original anatomical position in their resting place. Let's hope that if they keep digging, they'll find even more material belonging to this giant.
September, Henry the Paleoguy.
Hadrosauridae, which contains 2 subfamilies, both Saurolophinae, animals like Edmontosaurus, and Olympiasaurinae, animals like Parasaurolophus, were a very successful group of animals, with them having a cosmopolitan range and very high taxonomic diversity. Their success has often been attributed to their highly specialised males, although their foraging strategies remain unclear. In extant herbivores, big shape reflects the types of consumed plants and what one cell targets, and alongside locomotion strategies and proportions also does the same. The first study to be covered for this video went over this very discussion, and how these 2 groups may have differed in their feeding, and what this could therefore mean for both the niches they both took up, and how they each interacted with each other. Using hadrosaurid big shape and limb segment proportions as proxies of both food selection and locomotor cost respectively, the final dataset used amassed up to 13 taxa, covering animals of all different size ranges. Both subfamilies are likely to have coexisted in the same spaces, as suggested by a few bone beds mainly in America and China, and so they most definitely were ecologically competitive amongst each other to some extent. What was found regarding the beak shapes was that Hadrosauridae beaks were generally anteriorly narrower, posteriorly wider, and dorsiventrally shallower than Lambeosaurinae beaks, and that they were statistically different enough to be an intrinsic difference, and not just an allometric or growth-related artifact. This suggests a slight difference in their feeding strategies, with the Lambeosaurines seeming to have more of a tendency to have more bulk-consuming behaviour with less selectivity than Saurolophines, indicating that they were eating generally lower quality foods, also having better adaptations for grazing their food to do so when compared to Saurolophines, which were the opposite. In addition, their limb proportions show that they also differ quite a bit there too, although more generally, as it was found that Saurolophines had shortened proximal limb segments than Lambeosaurines, and that coastal dwelling hadrosaur forelimbs as a whole were shorter when compared to ones from more inland environments. Said shorter forelimbs appear better suited for temporary bipedalism than when compared to longer ones, that which also indicates differing adaptations to feeding heights, potentially down to differing regional vegetation. The longer proximal but shorter distal limb segments of Saurolophines would have provided them with greater stability, although a higher cost regarding the swinging of the limbs due to an apparent increase in the gyration, whereas the more energy efficient proportions of the Lambeosaurines indicates that they may have foraged in larger areas, although said difference still needs to be looked into some more. In conclusion, we still have much to learn about the differing habitats and food preferences these large and often overlooked animals took part in, and studies like these really go a long way in helping to understand them and how these two groups differed. Thalassocnus, the only genus of their subfamily, Thalassocinae, is among the most unusual members of an already unusual group, being the Xenarthrans, which includes living sloths, anteaters and armadillos, being among some of the earliest branching clades among placental mammals. Interpreted and known to be semi-aquatic in nature, potentially being preyed upon by raptorial sperm whales, and foraging off of the coasts of Miocene and Pliocene Peru and Chile, where they were known to be confined to until now. Remains from the radius, ulna, and part of an articulated left manus were recently found from the upper member of the Tafna Formation in the eastern Puna, Argentina, being the first remains of them being found in a continental setting. The specimen for morphological and phylogenetic analysis appears to be most closely related to the most basally branching and less adapted of the group to marine habitats, having the possibility of having a more frugivorous or omnivorous diet. This is quite the important find, since its location is more than 1,171 kilometers away from the Peruvian locality and 750 kilometers away from the nearest ones in Chile, which greatly extends their range from more typically coastal environments to terrestrial ones, and that their evolutionary and paleobiogeographic history is more complex than was previously known. A diverse group of marine diapsids, most derived plesiosaurs fall into either one of the two body forms, those with proportionally small heads and elongated necks, which clade within the plesiosauroids, are most well known from animals like Dolichorhynchops, and a newly described animal that lived alongside them in the Western Interior Seaway has managed to add to this group's understanding. Serpentisucops from the late Cretaceous of Wyoming in the Pierre Shale is notable for having both the large, elongated jaws of their group, alongside a long neck with around 23 vertebrae, which may have aided them in being more able to engage in rapid, lateral striking to snag fast and small prey. Their name derives from the Latin serpent, meaning snake, sucus meaning crocodile, and ops meaning face, with their species name of Phaestrae being named for Anna Phaester, the landowner whose generosity afforded both the excavation and donation of the type specimen. Composed of a partial skull, lower jaw, vertebral column, plus a left ilium and pubis. Embedded in fine grey shale, they were quite sizable animals, at about 7 meters in length, with phylogenetic analysis finding that their long necks were a secondarily derived trait, and one convergence with that of both ancestral plesiosaurs and contemporaneous elasmosaurids. Titanosaurian sauropods are known from animals like Argentinosaurus and Patagotitan for being able to reach among the largest sizes known for terrestrial vertebrate life, and showing just how far anatomical boundaries can be pushed. Some, however, were quite a bit smaller and more modest, including one of the newest described of their group, being among the smallest of all sauropods known, being named Iberania parva. Their name comes from a combination of the words Ibera, the municipality where the specimens were recovered from, and Ania, a modified form of the Greek word plania, meaning wanderer. Their specific name of parva is derived from the Latin word parvus, which means small after, well, their apparent small size, and the full name coming out as Little Ibera/Tree Wanderer. Dating from the Upper Cretaceous, Santonian through Campanian ages, this new taxon has an estimated body length of about 5.7 meters, with them being confirmed through histological and CT scan analyses that they were indeed represented by skeletally mature individuals, in spite of how tiny they seem when compared to their relatives. Phylogenetic research has recovered them as a part of the subfamily Saltasaurinae, a clade which is generally known for containing sauropods on the smaller end of the spectrum. The first of their kinds to be reported to be living in Brazil, Saltasaurians appear to display a conspicuous reduction in their body size as a general occurrence, which has been theorised as either a response to geographical restriction to the vast north and south corridor of the Andean region, or potentially in regards to them occupying new environments previously occupied by other genera. Said environments where they lived were similar to today, inland and arid, which is presumed by the authors of the study as the reason behind their dwarfism to conserve energy, which is in contrast to other dwarf sauropods like Magurosaurus and Europasaurus, which attain their short statures because of island dwarfism. Something also interesting to note is the pathologies present on them, with one having acute osteomyelitis or bone swelling from some kind of injury in their fibula, and having fossilised parasites associated with said bone lesions, with this being the first reported parasites preserved in situ inside the vascular canals of a dinosaur. The taxonomy of these most unusual microfossils is currently under study by the rest of the team, who carried out the study of the sauropods, so time will tell as to the identity of these even smaller organisms. Pachycephalosaurs are a group of generally small ornithischians that are most well known for the reinforced frontal and parietal bones that are fused into a thickened skull dome, with it being a prime source of research and speculation as to how their dome functions, with it being implicated in intraspecific head-butting contests, whether they be head-on-head or head-on-flank. Despite their general lack of postcranial material, their solid heads usually being the only pieces of anatomy to be preserved, the few that do show quite some unusual morphology. Their hind limbs are relatively stout when compared to other bipedal ornithischians, and their torso and pelvic regions are comparably broad as well, alongside a tail base that is also very wide and surrounded by a caudal basket of ossifications unique to their group. Stegosaurus is one of the best known and also best preserved of their group, and so were recently used for a study that will soon be covered that reconstructed the appendicular myology, the musculature system of a pachycephalosaur for the first time, as well as providing a detailed consideration of the functioning of the postcranium when it comes to their use in purported head-butting events. Stegosaurus valisum was found to have enlarged muscle attachment sites, with key muscles like the cauda femoralis and ischiocordalis being sizable. This, coupled with their wide pelvis, stout hind limbs, as well as their ossified tails, produces a very stable structure, which would help to keep the animals steady when engaging in conflicts with each other, as is pretty evident that they did given all of their adaptations. From this, it's clear that the postcrania allow them to be more effective headbutters/rammers than they would be otherwise, with them being adapted to both receive large forces and then deliver them back.
October, Spencer Mayhew of Cretaceous Cast.
Evolution of fins thanks to Tugiaspis. Paired fins are a major evolutionary change that occurred after jawed vertebrates split off from the jawless vertebrates. Extinct armored jawless stem gnathostomes have a variety of fin types, from skeletal bits and baubles to simple flippy flaps. Osteostracans are related to jawed vertebrates and are thought to have had the first true pairs of appendages in the pectoral region. Later, pelvic appendages evolved along with jaws. Using fossils of Tugiaspis vividus from the Silurian period of China, a team of Chinese, Spanish, and British paleontologists led by Dr. Ji-Kun Gai have found that the jawless fish group known as the Galeaspids, which are related to both osteostracan fish and jawed vertebrates, had three dorsal fins that were not paired, a hypocaudal tail that was almost symmetrical, and a pair of continuous ventrolateral fins that went from the head to the tail. The ventrolateral fins are like the paired fin flaps of other stem gnathostomes, and the ventrolateral ridges of cephalaspid osteostracans, whose pectoral fins are also different. Some parts of the fin fold theory about how paired appendages came to be in vertebrates can be explained by the ventrolateral fins. Galeaspids have a condition similar to that of osteostracans and jawed vertebrates. In this condition, paired fins first appeared as continuous pectoral pelvic lateral fins that, according to computed fluid dynamics experiments, gave the animal lift without moving. Only when the pectoral fins of osteostracans and jawed vertebrates evolved later along the stem lineage did they move to the front. After this later change, the rest of the fin's abilities were limited to a pelvic position, which made active propulsion and steering easier. New kitty, Pangurbin edgiae. Near the start of the late Eocene, between 40 and 37 million years ago, the first hypercarnivorous niches were filled by crown carnivorans and their closest relatives. This happened after the Mesonychia and Oxynodonta groups of meat-eaters died out or went extinct, leaving only carnivoriforms and hyenodontan meat-eaters as high trophic level consumers. Until now, it wasn't clear how this change happened and how much each taxonomic group contributed. A team of researchers, including Ashley Paust, Paul Barrett, and Susumu Tamiya, published their work on a new carnivoran which they named Pangurbin edgiae, a new genus and species of the saber-toothed mammal carnivore family Nemravidae from the Eocene Pomerado conglomerate in Southern California. This animal had features strongly adapted for eating meat. Even though Pangurbin edgiae is the oldest named Nemravid in North America based on geochronology, it is related to Hoplophoneus based on phylogenetics. This proves, without a doubt, that nimravid carnivores spread quickly across Asia and North America and put limits on when early divergences within the family happened. Pangerba and Egier closes the gap between convergent forms of saber-toothed mammalian carnivores and shows how quickly the hypercarnivorous nimravids changed during a time when the climate was unstable around the world. Also, it shows how North American ecosystems changed from top to bottom during the Eocene-Oligocene transition, which is when the carnivore forms became trophic specialists for the first time, a role they still have today. Cranial osteology and paleobiology of the early Cretaceous bird, J. halornis. J. halornis is one of the earliest lineages of birds to split from the family tree. It's important because it shows how birds' bodies changed over time. Even though about 100 specimens have been found, not much is known about the shape of its head because it was not well preserved in 2 dimensions. This makes it hard to understand the shape and ecology of the important bird lineage, J. halornithiforms, as well as how the head changed during the origin and early evolution of birds. A huge team of scientists published research in the Zoological Journal of the Linnaean Society, which provides a detailed description of the cranial osteology of J. halornis prima, based mostly on high-quality 3-dimensional data of a recently reported specimen. With the exception of the rostrum, which is more specialized, new information about the skull confirms that it has generally plesiomorphic traits. A large number of specimens show that the dental formula of J. halornis prima is 0, 2, 3. Which is different from what was thought before, which was that the presence of maxillary teeth is a sign of a different species, J. halornis palmapennis. Their research also shows that J. halornis had evolved in ways that affected its senses. For example, its olfactory bulbs were bigger than those of other known stem birds, which suggests that smell was an important part of J. halornis's environment. The digitally reconstructed scleral ring within the eye suggests a strong diurnal or daytime habit, which supports the idea that early diverging birds were mostly active during the day. A new horseshoe crab, Luntaspis borealis. As a group, horseshoe crabs are known for their morphological conservatism. In other words, they seem to stay the same over long periods of evolutionary and geologic time, which is typically only broken up by big changes in appearance when they live in non-marine environments. It has been suggested that horseshoe crabs have always grown in the same way throughout their evolution. James Lamsdale, Philip Isotalo, David Rudkin, and Marcus Martin described a new species of horseshoe crab from the Ordovician of Kingston, Ontario, Canada, based on juvenile and adult specimens. This new species provides important information about how the earliest horseshoe crabs grew and what they looked like. It shows that at least some Paleozoic forms had pterygites that could move freely in front of the fused thoracotron and epithosoma with 13 segments. More ancient fishes, Zeuxanastius mirabilis, and Scenacanthus vermiformis. Molecular studies show that the first jawed vertebrates probably appeared no later than the late Ordovician period, about 450 million years ago. Together with disassembled microfossils of possible fish from the Ordovician and early Silurian periods, plenty of studies have shown that jawed vertebrates evolved quickly before and right after the end Ordovician mass extinction. But until now, the earliest complete fossils of jawed fishes that let scientists figure out their shape in detail came from the late Silurian, about 425 million years ago. The early history of jawed vertebrates has been hard to figure out because there aren't many fossils of whole animals that are still in one piece from before the late Silurian. A team of Chinese paleontologists published their research on a new conservat Lagerstadt found in the 436 million-year-old early Silurian rocks of Chongqing, South China. It has a variety of well-preserved jaw fishes with whole bodies. The most common species, which they named Zeuxanosteus mirabilis, is a placoderm or jawed stem gnathostome. It has traits from major placoderm subgroups and shows how the skull roof pattern changed from placoderms to modern bony fishes. Another fish from this new location, this one being from the cartilaginous fish group, the team described as Scenacanthus vermiformis. It has armor plates on its thorax that have never been seen before in this group, as well as a large midline dorsal plate like placoderms. Together, these species showed that jawed vertebrates changed in ways that had not been seen before in the early Silurian. It also provides new information on the body plans of these ancient fish groups. Scleromochlus and the early evolution of Pterosauromorpha. Pterosaurs were the first backboned animals to develop powered flight. From their sudden origin in the late Triassic to their extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, they were major players of terrestrial ecosystems. But it is hard to figure out where pterosaurs came from and how they evolved, because they are so different from their closest relatives, the logorpterids, or their more distant relatives, the dinosaurs. Scleromochlus is a small reptile from the early late Triassic of Scotland that was first discovered over a century ago. It was thought to be a key taxon closely related to pterosaurs, but its poor preservation has made it hard to study and caused plenty of debate over its phylogenetic position, with some even questioning whether it was an archosaur at all. New research was published by a slew of American and European scientists on Scleromochlus in Nature Research, in which microcomputed tomography scans were used to make the first accurate whole skeleton reconstruction and a new diagnosis of Scleromochlus. These scans show new anatomical details that prove it was a close relative of pterosaurs and belonged to the group called Pterosauromorpha, which is made up of the archosaurs known as lagarterids and the true pterosaurs. Scleromochlus is more similar to the lagarterids than to pterosaurs in terms of its body structure, and it still has many traits that were probably present in the very first members of Aviometatarsalia to split off. Aviometatarsalia being the group that also includes dinosaurs and birds. These results support the idea that the first flying reptiles evolved from tiny, ground-dwelling ancestors that were probably able to walk on two legs. Amplectister pteropoides. Myrmecophilia is the phenomenon in nature when different species of organisms form relationships with different species of ants. This usually occurs with other invertebrate groups, but I suppose it doesn't have to. In the clown beetle family Hysteridae, there are several unrelated lineages that have these kinds of relationships. Based on a few fossils found in Kachin Amber in northern Myanmar, recent studies suggest that the origin of Myrmecophilia can be traced back to the mid-Cretaceous. Shuei Yamamoto and Michael Caterino published their findings on a new species of ancient beetle with ant-loving habits from Kachin Amber in the Paleo World Journal. This new species, Amplectister pteropoides, is the second species of the extinct genus Amplectister that has been found in the same amber deposit. The new species has the most heavily derived back legs of any fossil hysterid beetles or even any beetles so far found. This is more evidence that they live near ant colonies. This finding shows drastic changes in body shape were already happening in the Cretaceous to help animals live with ants.
November, paleoanalysis.
A lot of the new discoveries that were made during November this year were new species being named. So that will be the primary theme of this video. And first up, we have a small herbivorous dinosaur found in the Willow Tank Formation in southern Nevada. Rightly named Nevadadromeus scamidae, this find may be fragmentary, but it actually could have a big impact in our understanding of the evolution of different dinosaur groups as they spread across the northern hemisphere during the early Cretaceous. This is the oldest known member of a family of small fleet-footed plant eaters called Thelescalosauridae, found in North America. And what's interesting about Nevadadromeus is it shows a combination of features of the two major subfamilies that are found later in the period, later Thelescalosaurids and the Orodromids. Now, we know that these two groups were closely related, as you can plainly see at a glance, but they do have several key differences that distinguish the two subfamilies. And this find helps us paint a more complete picture of this rather confusing branch of the Ornithischian dinosaurs. An order that seriously seems like it's been reshuffled almost as often as everything that we think we know about Spinosaurus. And in fact, up next we have another new discovery that shows this successful order of dinosaurs living in one of the most interesting environments that we know of the time. Next up, we have to travel halfway around the world and to a later time in the Mesozoic, to Romania around 70 million years ago. Now, what you have to realize about this region is that it was extremely different in just about every conceivable way from what we see today. Most of Europe was inundated with a shallow sea, and there were islands all throughout, forming a subtropical archipelago. And for many of the large animals from the mainland, this would isolate them and start to do some interesting things to their biology. This is another example of islands causing animals to shrink to accommodate the lack of space and food available in the area. So we see things like dwarf sauropods and, by Mesozoic standards, tiny crocodiles. The thing is, these were the animals that had adapted to be on Hatzag Island for a long time. Now, many of the islands throughout Europe were divided by shallow seas, but Hatzag Island in particular had a very deep trench that went around it. This would make it much more difficult for animals to be able to island hop to get back and forth, isolating animals like the sauropods and making it to where they couldn't return to the mainland. But apparently some animals did manage to travel to this island later, because this is where our new discovery comes in. The ornithopod known as Transylvaniasaurus. Now, on the mainland, Transylvaniasaurus would have been a pretty modestly sized herbivore at around 2 meters. But on Hatzag, it was 1/3 the size of the largest plant-eating dinosaur around, the sauropod Magiosaurus. So this probably gave it quite the advantage on this lost world within the Cretaceous world. And because it's so similar in size to its mainland cousins, it's thought that this was an example of a later spread of dinosaurs to the island, and that they were not here alongside the sauropods when the inland sea first cut off Hatzag from the mainland. And to me, it's really interesting to think about the implications of something like this happening. Especially since we see so very often today just how fragile island habitats can be to the introduction of invasive species. I think one day I will have to make a video talking about Hatzag Island in more detail. In the meantime though, I know Henry the Paleoguy has made a great one about it. But as long as new discoveries keep coming out of Romania, there's still going to be a lot more to discuss on this topic. For our next discovery, we have the kind of thing that paleontologists get really excited about. Not only do we have a new species, but we have a fossil that is so well preserved that it even shows internal organs as well as the animal's last meal. Now, Cretaceous fossils from China showing remarkably well preserved imprints of small bird-like theropods sporting a covering of feathers is nothing new now. Fossils showing these traits have been the entire cause of the feather revolution, and they've been pouring out of China for the past 2 decades. But a fossil with this level of exquisite detail is not something that you see every day. They named the new species Darlongwangi, and this thing can teach us so much. We've got feathers, we've got basically a complete skeleton, and we even have the remains of this animal's intestines. How is that even possible, you ask? Well, if you look at this dark patch here, under closer inspection, it was discovered that this was the result of densely packed microcrystals, formed from the bacteria in the stomach as the lining of the intestines decayed. And within this dark patch of crystallized guts, the scientists found the partial skeleton of a frog. The Darlongwangi specimen shows the very first case of intestinal preservation in a theropod lineage very close to birds. Although this animal was not an actual bird, it was a close relative to the true avian dinosaurs that had already evolved at the time. Birds likely lived right alongside Darlong and many of the other similar animals that occupied the Cretaceous forests. And finally, we come to what was probably the biggest discovery made in November 2022. Another new species announcement. And once again, another animal from the Cretaceous. But this was a whole new species of Tyrannosaurid. More specifically, a new species of the genus Daspletosaurus. Named Daspletosaurus wilsoni. For a long time, we only had one species in the Daspletosaurus genus, known as Daspletosaurus torosus. And then, in 2017, Jack Horner found a smaller skeleton, which was coined Daspletosaurus horneri. This animal lived around 2 million years later than Torosus. So, between the size, age, and anatomical differences, it was decided that these were 2 distinct species. And then now this year, with the discovery of wilsoni, it seems to be perfectly filling in the gaps. For one thing, Daspletosaurus wilsoni falls perfectly in between Horneri and Torosus in the Cretaceous, being around 75 million years old. It also is larger than Daspletosaurus horneri and smaller than Daspletosaurus torosus. And it even shares many of the different traits of both the younger and older species. We don't normally get such a picture-perfect transition in the fossil record. And the truth is, more than likely, as more fossils are found, it's probably not going to be quite as cut and dry as this turned into this turned into this. It's not only plausible, but probable that 2 or more members of this genus lived alongside each other in Cretaceous North America. I like to use living animals as an example, so look at it this way. Within the genus Panthera, there are 5 major species: the tiger, the lion, the leopard, the jaguar, and the snow leopard. And 6 if you count the clouded leopard, but that's technically a neophelid. These related predators, all part of the same genus, exist on Earth at the same time because they all live different enough lives and inhabit different enough habitats to be able to survive without pushing the others to extinction. So perhaps the Daspletosaurs were getting progressively smaller to fill a slightly different niche on the landscape from possibly larger tyrannosaurs, like the branch that would lead to T-Rex in a couple million years' time. I love Daspletosaurus, partly because in the past couple of years it has been a really fascinating animal to study as we learn more about the complicated family tree of the most powerful land predators the world has ever known. But also because a tooth of one of these was actually the very first dinosaur fossil I have ever had the pleasure of adding to my fossil collection.
December. That's me. New toothed bird upends bird evolution. Genevis. The 2 major groups of modern birds, Neonathae and Paleonathae, can be told apart by their bony palates. Neonates have palate bones that aren't fused together and jointed skulls, while Paleonates have stiff skulls with the pterygoid and palatine fused into one piece, which has long been thought to be the case for the first birds, the Neornithes. But there aren't many fossils of palatal remains from taxa close to the origin of this group. This makes it hard to draw strong conclusions about how the ancestor of the Neornithine palate looked. A team from Cambridge University published their findings on a new toothed bird from the Cretaceous that helps provide a new notch in the understanding of bird evolution. They described a new type of toothed ornithurine with a pterygoid that looks a lot like those of the living water and landfowl groups. Genevis finalidens, as they have named it, pretty much looked rather similar to the well-known Mesozoic ornithurine Ichthyornis, but Genevis is much bigger and has a much higher level of postcranial pneumaticity. This shows that the Ichthyornis group was still around in the latest Cretaceous. Genevis confirms that at least some Mesozoic non-crown ornithurines had anatomically neonathous palate bones. This suggests that crown birds may have pterygoids like those of living fowl. The results, along with new information about the palatine of Ichthyornithines, change what people have thought for a long time about the ancestral crown bird palate. This forces a rethinking of the evolution of the defining traits of birds. Another semi-aquatic dinosaur found, Natovenator. For aquatic animals to move quickly through the water, they have to make their bodies more streamlined. It is well known that diving birds have streamlined bodies, but this has never been seen in non-avian dinosaurs. The main reason is that, with a few exceptions, most of the known non-avian theropods lived on land. Even in the groups that are thought to be semi-aquatic, there is no clear evidence that their bodies are streamlined. A group of handsome researchers published their description of what they named Natovenator polydontus in the journal Communications Biology. Natovenator is a new theropod from the Upper Cretaceous of Mongolia, with a well-preserved skeleton containing several mobile dorsal ribs arranged in a way similar to diving birds to make the body more efficient. Its wide-arched proximal rib shafts show that the rib cage is compressed from the back to the front, like aquatic reptiles. Natovenator's body shape suggests that it might have been able to swim and hunt. This type of body shape developed separately in different lines of theropod dinosaurs. It was a close relative to Halschkaraptor, another goose-like dromaeosaur from the same area but different time. Both have been controversial as to how aquatic they really were, but that is a discussion for a full video. Miniature South American Notosaurid shakes up armored dino evolution, Patagopelta. The evolution of the armored dinosaurs, Urankylosaurs and Stegosaurs, is well documented, but not well understood. That is thanks to their remains being few and far between. They had so much armor that it all fell off of the body when they died and got fossilized at random. A few new armored dinosaur discoveries over the last few years have called into question what we know about these angry pineapples. Those critters are ones you are no doubt familiar with thanks to my ramblings: Stegoros, Antarctopelta, Spicomelus, and Jacopil. These guys come from the southern hemisphere, where ankylosaurs are extremely rare and oddly small and weird. A brand new ankylosaur from the southern hemisphere that is technically not all that new is extremely weird due to the very fact that it is not that weird. A team of South American scientists published their paper on this new little armored guy in December, naming it Patagopelta cristata. They were able to figure out that the critter belongs to the nodosaurid family of ankylosaurs, making it a much more advanced or late evolving form of the dinosaurs than those weird offshoots that have been getting published in recent years. This says a lot about the evolution and migration of the armored dinosaurs, but more are needed from different continents and times to get a full picture of this radiation. A modern lizard in the Triassic? Mammals, birds, and squamates, or lizards, snakes, and relatives, are some of the most important living vertebrates. Understanding how they evolved is key to answering important questions in biodiversity science. We know a lot about where mammals and birds came from, but not much about where squamates came from. A groundbreaking study was just published by David Whiteside, Sophia Chambi-Trowell, and Michael Benton on a small fossil reptile from the Triassic. This new reptile, which they named Cryptovaranoides microlanius, lived in England 202 million years ago and preserved a partial skeleton, skull, and jaws. It has at least 15 traits that are unique to squamates, and it also has some traits in common with unidentatans and anguimorphs. The new find shows that the origin of modern snakes and lizards is much older than was previously thought, and the new dates show that modern-type lizards and snakes changed a lot after the Carnian pluvial episode, which happened 232 million years ago. Ritualistic combat in ankylosaurs. Besides the armor, the most notable trait of the armored dinosaurs was their clubbed tails, though half of this family did not have clubs on their tails, but we will ignore this for right now. Plenty have assumed the only purpose for this not at all vaguely weapon-shaped structure was as a weapon. The handle of the hammer, the majority of the tail, was long, fused, and stiff, and was connected to a highly mobile set of vertebrae on the dinosaur's ass that would have heaved the club from side to side with extreme prejudice and force. No mystery about it, right? A brand new study led by Victoria Arbor argues that ankylosaur tail clubs were the result of sexual selection and were mostly used for fighting within the same species. In the holotype specimen of Zool currivastator, they found pathological osteoderms, which are like armor plates. These plates are only on the sides of the hips, not all over the body, which is consistent with injuries caused by sideways tail swinging and ritualized combat. They were not able to find strong evidence that predation was a key factor in the development of the tail club. The sexual selection hypothesis is further supported by the fact that the size of the tail club changes a lot over evolutionary time and grows slowly. There is no doubt that the tail club could have been used for defense, but their findings suggest that sexual selection was the driving force behind the development of this powerful weapon. This changes the way most people think about ankylosaurs. It suggests that they had complex behaviors and probably fought ritualized battle for social dominance, like other ornithischian dinosaurs and mammals. That's been PaleoRewind 2022. I was out of town the week all of this was going up, and so I couldn't account for last-minute changes, but those happen when you least expect them. Hopefully you all had a good 2022, and I think we can all agree that we are looking forward to 2023 and all the fossil discoveries that will entail. By the time this comes out, they probably already have published all sorts of cool things. Let me know in the comment section below what you hope is discovered this year. I'm hoping that rumored Therizinosaurus skull paper finally publishes this year, to be honest.